We are super excited for this topic, and so is the bee community. So just really excited to be talking about carbon footprinting here today. I'm Giselle Waters, and I am the communications chair here at B Local PDX. Just to get started, I want to let you know that B Local PDX is a group of certified B corporations from Oregon and Southwest Washington, really working to foster and deepen connections among organizations in our region and folks who share our purpose and passion for using business as a force for good. And then for any folks who are not as familiar with B Corps, B corporations are for-profit companies who are certified by the nonprofit B Lab to meet rigorous standards of social and environmental performance, accountability, and transparency. So just wanted to give you all that kind of starting off point and then let you know that today we're going to be talking about Carbon Footprinting 101 and that Heather Schrock has kindly joined us to talk about this for a second time. She is the Director of Environmental Partnerships at Bonneville Environmental Foundation and is going to share about how to understand what carbon scopes are, how to identify them in your own business practices, and how to set realistic goals to reduce and offset your greenhouse gas impact and meet your net zero by 2030 challenge that so many B Corps have signed up for. Just a couple of quick organizational items. If you are not speaking, please keep your mic muted and have your video on if you are able to. The presentation will be about an hour and then we'll have some time for Q&A. You can also feel free to leave your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and shout them out. Heather has given us all permission to do that, so feel free to reach out if you have a question. And then just so you know, I will be sort of managing the chat and letting Heather know if you don't want to shout out your question or you aren't in a situation where you can do that. And this event is also being recorded just so that you know. So if you do have to hop off early or anything like that, we will be sending the recording. There will also be a breakout session where you have the opportunity to kind of chat through some things together and get to know each other a little bit better. So just watch out for that. And yeah, I'm just going to hand it over to Heather to get started on our presentation. Thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me again. I love this topic, as weird as that might sound. It's very interesting to me. I learned about this through my work at Bonneville Environmental Foundation. Took a crash course when I first started in greenhouse gas accounting and I have been doing it ever since. So today I will be taking you through, this is a 101 level, so it is very basic. There's definitely a lot of rabbit holes to go down in greenhouse gas accounting, but today we're going to keep it fairly high level. And I'm also going to do my best to tie it to the B Lab assessment and to the net zero challenge that a lot of you are probably a part of. So and then if, I don't know if she's on right now, but if Jennifer Cooper hops on the call, please let me know. She is the chair of the B Corp Climate Group, and she has also been helpful in designing some of the guidance for that net zero challenge. So hopefully she'll be able to join us later. If not, she did send me some info about it that I'll share, but it's ever evolving information about the net zero challenge, so there'll be more information forthcoming. But to get started, I'll tell you just a tiny little bit about myself and why I'm here. As I said, I work at Bonneville Environmental Foundation. I have been doing greenhouse gas accounting for over 4 years now, and I love teaching about this subject, especially to businesses like you all, because the information out there that's generally available is usually either very complicated and it's just hard to even get your head around, you know, all of these greenhouse gas accounting rules and regulations, or it's oversimplified. So I'm trying to give you guys something that's a little in the middle, that'll give you guys some basic information to start learning the language, start learning what these words mean and the context for them. And there are so many other great resources out there as well that I'll list for you guys. So with that, I'll tell you guys one more thing about myself. I always like to share a weird fact about myself at the beginning, and feel free to throw a weird fact about yourself into the chat too. I was a cruise line singer for 12 years. So talk to me about that offline sometime. I actually had a different weird fact I was going to share today, but you inspired me, Jimmy. Got a musician on the line here. So I thought I'd share that because it's kind of a weird thing. So if you guys want to share some fun and weird facts about yourself, throw them in the chat. And I'm going to get started on the presentation here. Okay, time to share screen. Hopefully this works. Giselle, let me know if you can see the presentation. Does it look good? Can you see the previews?
I cannot see the previews. I can see your bar, like your bottom bar, but I don't think I'll be able to see it once you go to the next slide. We'll see.
You can see this thing that I'm moving around?
Not the thing you're moving around, just your desktop bar, sorry.
I see. I don't know how to get rid of that. It's clearly does not want to go away. Anyone has any suggestions how to make that go away, let me know. Otherwise, it looks like it's stuck there.
Yeah, sometimes you can right click and put turn hiding off, or turn hiding on in this case. There we go.
Look at that. It's all about the right click.
I know.
Always a right click somewhere. Okay, here we go. Greenhouse gas accounting 101 for B Corps. As I said, I do want to start with just a little bit of context about my organization so you know where this is coming from and why we do this. As I said, I'm from Bonneville Environmental Foundation. We go by BEF most times. And it is our vision and mission to work at the intersection of water, energy, and carbon. So this little piece of what I'm doing for you today, this carbon accounting workshop, is one small slice of our overall work in water, energy, and carbon. And most important, we have our core values, which are really important to us. And you'll see partnership right there is first. So forming partnerships with all of you, forming and providing knowledge and education is so important to us. So that's why I love doing workshops like this, because it is sometimes planting the seed to more partnerships and getting to work with more wonderful businesses and other nonprofits as well. So greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gases are gas. Sometimes that's not the most obvious thing about them, but they are gases. They go into the atmosphere and they trap heat. So where do these greenhouse gases come from? This slide is slightly out of date, but I did compare it with the EPA's 2020 report, and it is almost exactly the same, but I just really like this graphic, so I kept it. The EPA one's just a boring like PowerPoint pie chart, so I think this one's much better. But this is still approximately the distribution of greenhouse gases globally. If you were to take a look at greenhouse gases in the US, you would see that transportation is a little bit higher on that list, but it still is about the same spread. So one of the things I like to start with when we're talking about greenhouse gas accounting is language, what we call things. And these two terms, CO2 and greenhouse gases, there's other words like carbon, carbon dioxide, CO2, CO2e, greenhouse gases. There's many of these words used interchangeably. And even I will use these words interchangeably, especially in casual conversation. But it is really important to know that they don't all mean the same thing, and that there is a difference. And when you are doing greenhouse gas accounting, you are actually accounting for all the greenhouse gases. So CO2, of course, is the most prevalent gas in the atmosphere that is contributing to global warming. But all these greenhouse gases, the nitrous oxides, the methanes, the fluorinated gases, they're all combined. When you put them all together and you do greenhouse gas accounting, you would call that CO2e. That is the shorthand. So if you did do some greenhouse gas accounting, at the end of your report, you might see that little E and wonder what that stands for. It just means that it is including all of those gases in the final number. That said, again, most of these terms you really can use interchangeably, especially in casual conversation. Obviously, terms like carbon neutral, they don't say CO2e neutral or greenhouse gas neutral. Carbon neutral still means the same thing, but it's good to know that language. And speaking of other greenhouse gases, It's also important to know that they all have their different potencies out there. Methane in particular is a very high potency greenhouse gas. So for example, 504 pounds of methane is the equivalent of over 11,000 pounds of carbon dioxide in terms of its heat trapping capabilities. So even a small amount of methane can do a lot of damage. So that's why it's important not to forget about those other greenhouse gases. And 2 cows produce about 500 pounds of methane a year. And just so everyone knows, interesting side note, most people think that gas is coming out of one end of the cow. It's actually coming out of the other end. Most of that greenhouse gas comes out of their mouth from their digestive processes. So since I'm with a bunch of B Corps today, how many people have taken the B Corp assessment? I'm guessing pretty much all of you. And if any of you remember these questions, were you able to, or do you think you would even now, feel free to put this in the chat, do you think you'd be able to answer any of these questions? And I did pull these off of the assessment. Go ahead and put it in the chat. I'd be curious to see. Just a yes or a no. Do you think you'd be able to answer these questions? Nope, seeing a lot of no's. Yes, in 1 month. All right, so, and that is why we're here today. I'm gonna put this slide up at the end and ask the same question. So hopefully we'll get a better understanding of how to approach these questions on the assessment in the future. Oh, okay. Here we go with what I think is the fun part, and you might find horribly boring, but here we go with the real meat of this presentation, which is the scopes. And this is what a lot of questions are about. So there is an organization called Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and they are probably the most widely used, accepted, industry standard organization that have created a framework for greenhouse gas accounting for businesses. And this is the piece that I have spent the most time studying and trying to understand. And it's not the worst, it's not terribly confusing once you really get into it, but I'm gonna try and put it out there for you guys so you can start thinking about this in terms of your own businesses and where your emissions might come from. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocols has separated emissions from business sources into 3 scopes. That first scope is direct emissions. And by direct, this means emissions that are owned by the company. So sources that are owned by the company, whether they're mobile or immobile. So that could be, a great example is an airline. They own those airplanes. So the fuel that they put in those airplanes, that is their scope 1. Which this particular graphic I'd love to change, because of course you see that airplane is in scope 3. But that's assuming that you're a passenger. So scope 3 is indirect. So this is why I use the airplane analogy, because it really comes down to, do you own the airplane, or are you a passenger in the airplane? Are you a guest of that airlines? Is going to be the difference between scope 1 and scope 3. So that direct emission source, scope 1, is going to be things like the natural gas or the fuel in owned vehicles. But really the main boundary here is what's owned, and are those emissions coming out of owned resources. Scope 2 is it's kind of its own little category there. It is indirect, but it is very specifically indirect electricity that is purchased. There's a few other things that fall into scope 2, which I've rarely ever seen, things like steam. I have one client in New York who still has steam, but it's not as common anymore, but who purchases steam, actually purchase steam. But this is purchased electricity. So this is real low-hanging fruit for most people. Basically, just take a look at your electricity bill and you see what your scope 2, at least your kilowatt hours are. We can talk a little later about the actual emissions and how you could convert those kilowatt hours to emissions, but you can see pretty easily what your scope 2 is there from your electricity bill. Scope 3 is indirect everything else. So these are all of these other things that you don't necessarily own, but that you're a part of. So I like to go to this next slide because this gives a much better illustration of what is involved in scope 3. Oh, by the way, I think Giselle said this in the beginning, but please feel free to unmute yourself and shout out at me if you do have a question. And you can also put it in the chat. Of course, Giselle's going to be helping me monitor that, but I do not mind you guys jumping out and waving your hands and telling me you have a question. That is totally okay. I am much more comfortable doing this in front of a room of crowded people than doing this online. So I don't mind the interaction. Please feel welcome to jump in if you need. So if you look at the scopes on this slide, this one gives you a little bit more of an idea of what goes into these scopes. I like this illustration, especially for scope 3, because it really does break it out a little bit more. And if you look at those kind of more purplish violet arrows, there's an arrow going in, and then there's an arrow coming out. That arrow kind of going towards the center can kind of be thought of as your upstream emissions. So those are the emissions from things that like go into your supply chain, for example, business travel, employee commuting, purchased goods and services. So you can see how this could quickly become a deep dark rabbit hole, scope 3, because there's the boundary around what you choose to include in scope 3 could get pretty big, pretty wide. So, you know, are you going to include every single thing in scope 3? Is it going to be like every roll of toilet paper that you've bought for your office? You know, and then when you look at the supply chain for the products themselves, if you're a product maker or a manufacturer, your scope 3 can tend to get pretty deep because of all the things you might buy to put together your product. However, if you're more of a different kind of business, like a consulting business, you may have very, very little scope 3. You may, for example, maybe you just do some traveling in your consulting work. You probably lease your offices if you're not working from home like most of us are. But scope 3 definitely, I would say, is where I get the most questions about what to include. And for different businesses, there's different things that go into scope 3. Different types of things that you might include. And one other thing to keep in mind, although the NetZero challenge is in front of you, for now, just thinking about your own business and your own emissions right now, it'd be good to not think too much about the NetZero until we get there. Right now, I just want you to think for a second about what would be the lowest hanging fruit. If you were to start today and do your greenhouse gas emissions accounting, what would be the lowest hanging fruit, the most obvious things that you should tackle first? This is usually how I would approach it with a business, is try not to make that boundary too wide, but think about, you know, what's really obvious for you, obvious for your business. So I'm actually gonna have you guys hop into some breakout rooms here to talk a little bit about your own emissions. I think there's gonna be about 4 per breakout room, correct? Yeah. Giselle's gonna be setting that up for me. And I'm gonna have you guys talk a little bit about your own emissions. So what I would ask you to do if you're on your computer with this is maybe take a quick screenshot of this slide so you can see what goes into all those different scopes. And I'm gonna give you a second to do that. And then I'm gonna move to the breakout room questions and encourage you to take a screenshot of that. One big lesson I've learned about hosting these Zoom breakout rooms is that once you go into your breakout room, you can't see the slides anymore. So if there's any important questions or information, you need to grab a screenshot of it. So if you've done that, grab your screenshot. Hopefully someone in your group has, if you haven't had a chance to do that. This is the breakout room exercise. I just want you guys to think about your own businesses and think about where your emissions are coming from in your businesses. Maybe pick 1 or 2 low-hanging fruit, 1 or 2 really obvious things in any of these scopes. And the challenge question here is, think of a way that you can reduce 1 or more of those specific emissions. So I did give an example here. If you have delivery trucks, one way you can reduce those emissions is to optimize those routes so that you use them less and you're not just going in, out, in, out, in, out, but more of a loop. And there's actually services that even do that for you. So grab a screenshot of this as well. And are we getting close to being ready for those breakout rooms, Giselle?
Yes, we are ready when everyone is ready. So we will just pop them out now.
So
All right.
I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. Please, when you go into these breakout rooms, take a second to just say hi, introduce yourself. And I'd love for this to be a discussion. Maybe you have some things in common with your businesses. And I will be back here with you guys in about 10 minutes. I'd love to hear how that went. If we could have a few folks maybe report out or ask questions. Part of the purpose of the exercise was to get you guys thinking about it so that you probably would come back with some questions like, where does this land? Is this in scope 1 or scope 3? So if you have any questions or want to share out any of your amazing ideas on how to reduce emissions, please go ahead. I know you're all shy.
Sure, I'll jump in and just say something. First of all, I think you've done a great job so far, Heather.
Thanks.
So on the screenshot that I took of the carbon offsets, scope 1, 2, and 3, fuel and energy related activities was listed in the arrow for scope 3 indirect, while company vehicles is scope 1 direct. Is that correct? If we have a transportation company and we have trucks, the fuel would be considered in scope 3, or is that part of what company vehicles is in scope 1?
Right. So it's really about the ownership. So if those are vehicles that are owned by the company, then the fuel for those owned vehicles is scope 1. That is considered direct. If you don't own the vehicles, if it's a third-party transportation company or distributor, then that fuel is considered scope 3.
Okay, and then just to clarify, we actually don't own any of our own trucks.
Okay.
But we maintain leases on several trucks, and we are a distribution company, so we are running those trucks and using the fuel. In that case, because we don't own the trucks, I think we still would consider that scope 1 because we pretty much do.
Yeah, it's leasing is a little tricky, even though technically leased assets is in scope 3. Sometimes people do put their, like, if you basically, like your situation, you basically kind of own the vehicles. I mean, you really are the only ones using them. It could land in scope 1. If you were to get super technical and you had to report to CDP or something, they would probably consider those scope 3 since they are leased assets. But for more casual reporting, like I would say for the B Corp assessment, you are a transportation company, that is what you do. I would say you could probably put it in scope 1.
Thank you.
Yeah, any other questions or things you want to share? Yeah, Annie?
Yeah, so this isn't what you asked me to share. I can say that next, but Ben Brill,
not working.
Ben Brill of New Seasons was in the same group as me, and it just got me thinking about all of their products that they have in their stores and how that would be part of scope 3, and also just considering how regional and locally focused they are, how that would be different than other grocery stores and how they could somehow demonstrate that in a greenhouse gas accounting, like final number. I don't know how you go about accounting for all of those different products.
Yeah, I would say doing comparisons with other business models can be tricky because getting actual and real data from like another business might be hard to do. Some businesses do publicly report though. So you could potentially do those side-by-side comparisons. I would guess that with New Seasons local and regional sourcing, they probably have a lower emissions on that particular element of their scope 3. I don't know what their other elements are contributing. Hello, that wasn't me. But yeah, I think that probably that has reduced their overall emissions by having that local focus. It would be really cool to do a comparison and to really account for that, to see what the difference would be, getting all that food from more local sources as opposed to, much farther away. Any other questions or stuff that came up for you guys for your own businesses that wasn't clear?
This is Chris Dennett. Just a quick, a little detailed question. What about all the forklifts and all the other, if they're not battery operated in inside production plants and stuff like that? That's scope 1.
It depends if they're owned. Yeah, if they're owned by the company, then that would be scope 1. Mm-hmm.
Lawnmowers?
Yeah, any yeah.
Really? Okay.
Any fuel.
Yeah, okay.
Being used by owned resources, exactly. Yeah, if they're not owned, you know, maybe, and maybe this wasn't what you were thinking, but maybe you were referring to like, if you own a building for your business and there's like landscapers coming and doing lawn mowing, you know, first of all, you'd have to decide if you'd want to include that in your scope 3 at all, and if you, in your emissions at all. And secondarily, if you did, it would be in scope 3 because you don't own those, but they are mowing your lawn. So, and this is where scope 3 can get hairy because people think, oh, I have to do all these things. And you don't necessarily have to include all of these. There's no, and I'm going to get into guidelines and frameworks and claims, but there's generally no set industry-wide accepted definition of what you must or must not include in scope 3. It depends, it might come down to individual certifications. Some certifications say you have to include XYZ and others say no. But as far as industry-wide standards and frameworks, while this is all in scope 3, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to include it all. That's where you arrive at your own boundaries for what you include and what you don't include. I did want to, speaking of that, oh, sorry, did someone have a question?
Nope. I guess I have a quick question.
Yeah.
In determining some of those things, so I'm from Grand Central Bakery, you know, one of our big ones in scope 3 is packaging.
Yeah.
So, you know, trying to determine the carbon footprint of your packaging without input from other companies that are producing that packaging, I guess that's kind of a huge sticking point for us. It clearly is, it should be included in our emissions work, but how we go about doing that is a really sticky subject.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the other thing that's tricky about scope 3 is so much of it is out of your control. And if you have suppliers that aren't willing or don't know how to do this, don't know how to even calculate their own emissions or aren't interested in it, it can make it really challenging, which is why you that may be a reason why you include or don't include something in your emissions. That said, there are a lot of resources to do estimated emissions. If you can't get real data, you may be able, I mean, say you're packaging, you know, Grand Central, you use brown paper bags for some of your bread, right? You could probably do some kind of like guesstimate about brown paper and how many pounds of it you use annually, and then use that. And again, I'll get to this more later too. What you say, your claims and your language have to just be really transparent, you know, that you didn't have real data for this. So we estimate it that's based on, you know, the EPA's coefficient for brown paper, right? So there are resources out there to do reasonable estimates, and that's really what people usually do expect, right? Especially for the size of business that most of you are, which is like kind of in that medium to smallish range. You can only do so much, and we all only have so much bandwidth too, right? One great question that Annie did bring up that I'm gonna repeat is, now that so many of us are working from home, how do you estimate electricity usage and things like that, right? Because we're all using our computers and all of our, you know, home electricity and heating. And that's another thing that really it's about making a reasonable estimate. So in Annie's case, what I had suggested is looking up the EPA's annual household electricity usage and using, you know, setting a percentage, say 50%, which is probably a little bit of an overshoot. You know, we don't necessarily actually spend 50% of our time necessarily working, but it's a reasonable estimate. And as long as you're transparent with how you came to that estimate, you know, you're going to be fine. But it at least gives you a reasonable idea of what the electricity is. And you could even, I see a comment here.
I was just saying, if you buy 100% renewable energy, you don't even have to do that calculation.
That's true. If you opt into renewable energy, oops, sorry, Alex.
No worries, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you could opt into renewable energy at home. I have worked with some companies who, since they've sent their workforce home, have actually paid for all of their employees to do the renewable energy option at home because they were doing it at their workplace. So anyway, that is true. You wouldn't even have to calculate it necessarily if you're 100% renewable. Any other thoughts or questions from the exercise that came up? Yeah, Kelsey?
Kelsey, there we go.
I'm unmuted now, sorry. Did you have like a recommended resource to do estimated emissions, or is it kind of just like depending on category, you would use a different one each time?
Yeah, there's several resources out there. I'd say some of the main ones would be the EPA. And for like any kind of energy data would be the EIA. What does that stand for? Energy. Oh gosh, I'm bad with acronyms. I remember acronyms and not names, but it's basically the US like Department of Energy. EIA has all these charts about averaged, therms of natural gas used per square foot in the average home, things like that. So yeah, thank you. Energy Information Administration. I was like, somebody's gonna Google it and put it in the chat. EIA, EPA, WRI, World Resources Institute, and of course the greenhouse gas protocols themselves. And then there's tons of really cool resources industry by industry that are just kind of like out there. Like I'm working with a coffee roaster, and Starbucks did this amazing kind of life cycle assessment and put out tons of information about emissions from the coffee roasting, coffee, that dairy is the biggest impact in coffee, the cups, all that stuff was on a Starbucks website. So sometimes you have to research a little deeper for really specific things. But yeah, there's a lot of great information out there, and most times it takes usually a Google search, you can find it. And there's also, I'm going to give you a bunch of consultants and referrals as well, including myself, that you can reach out to if you have something specific you need help with. But they're all kind of out there. Any other thoughts or questions before I move on? Nope. Nope. Okay. Liam. Double reporting. Right. Yeah, that's greenhouse gas protocols. They don't care about that. Scope 3, like it's not really an issue if you claim emissions from a farmer and then the farmer claims the emissions themselves, because there is the Paris Agreement, but that's not being accounted for in the same way. So if you claim emissions and your farmer claims emissions and everybody reduces and offsets, the only outcome of that is good. So there isn't really an issue with double reporting. Double counting is a different issue from double reporting. Double counting, like offsets, where two people claim an offset, that's where an issue comes up. But in terms of two people claiming the same emissions, if airlines claimed all their emissions and all the passengers are claiming them in scope 3, that's just not really an issue in the greenhouse gas protocols or World Resources Institute or EPA. Nobody really sees that as an issue. So yeah, Argonne National Laboratory, the division of either the EA or EPA. Oh, okay, Argonne National Laboratory. Thanks, Mark, for that. Okay, yeah, did that answer your question okay, Liam? I'm sorry if I'm not saying your name right. Okay, good. Okay, I am gonna move forward. I do have some more slides to get through. I know we have 90 minutes and I made the wild assumption I could get through all this in an hour, but might not happen. So always glad to have that extra time there. So I am gonna talk a little bit about, since we talked about reductions, obviously it is really important, and this is even stated in your net zero commitment for B Corp. It's stated in most types of commitments that first and foremost, it is really important to think about how you can reduce your emissions. how you can avoid your emissions so that you are just emitting less overall. So reductions, avoidance, really important. At the end of the day, there's usually some residual or unavoidable emissions that are still happening from business. I mean, unless we all walked into a forest and melted, and that probably still would have emissions associated with it. You know, we all have emissions. So we call that your unavoidable footprint. And I'm going to share my screen again. Make sure, okay. Giselle, you'll have to let me know if this works. Hold on.
I got you.
You got me. Take a second. Okay, see if this works.
Looks
Okay.
perfect.
Yes. Okay. So your unavoidable footprint can be balanced through these tools that have been created, these market tools. So carbon offsets and renewable energy certificates are two of the main tools used to balance that unavoidable footprint. And I'm actually very specifically using that word balance because that actually is in your B Corp. There's a really great, I'm still not sure if Jennifer Cooper joined the call yet. Is she there? Jennifer, are you there? Shout out yes if you are. Maybe not. Okay. She's from Native Energy and they are also a B Corp and she is on the B Corp climate. I'm probably going to call it the wrong thing, but they're the climate group. She's the chair of the climate group. And they put out a really great publication that I think would be a great resource for all of you to have about how to measure and reduce and offset. And they use the word balance, which I love, to balance your footprint. So for scope 1 and scope 3, carbon offsets really are the main tool. And I'll talk in a second about what those are and what that means. For scope 2, you actually do have a choice between two different instruments, renewable energy certificates or carbon offsets. It used to be that renewable energy certificates were kind of the only way to go, but I think people started realizing, and it is now accepted by greenhouse gas protocols and everything, that people should be allowed to use carbon offsets also for scope 2 if they want. So the material difference, the main two differences between these two instruments is the unit of measure and the claim that you can make. So I'm kind of agnostic, especially about the scope 2 thing, about whether people use RECs or offsets. I've had this conversation with a few people who are actually on the call today, my agnosticism about offsets and RECs in scope 2. It really comes down to what you as a business value and find important, and what you want to say about what you're doing and what you're claiming. So for carbon offsets, the unit of measure is a metric ton of CO2e. So that does include all greenhouse gases in that measurement, it's not just carbon. And when you purchase carbon offsets, you can claim to be offsetting your emissions. You can actively use that word, that you're offsetting. And when I speak of offsets, I really am speaking of third-party verified industry accepted offsets. It's a whole nother conversation to talk about offsets that aren't third-party verified. We're not going to get into that today, but for purposes of today, I am talking about actual third-party verified offsets that are valued in 1 metric ton of CO2e per unit. Now, with a renewable energy certificate, it is not measured in emissions. It is measured in kilowatt hours, and 1 renewable energy certificate is 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, or 1 megawatt hour. And the claim that you can then make is that you're using renewable energy, but you cannot say you're offsetting scope 2 if you use that claim. And vice versa, you cannot say you're using renewable energy if you purchase offsets for scope 2. So it's really about the claim that you want to make. I'm going to stop for just a second. Does anyone have a question? Does anyone? Nope, we're good. Okay.
From,
thought I maybe heard a little.
Ooh, there's one question from Mark.
Oh, you want for me?
Just, is it better in terms of renewable energy development and building infrastructure to buy RECs through your utility or through a third party?
So renewable energy certificates, yeah, no matter where I would say the advancement of the renewable energy field, it does advance more quickly the larger the project, because that is what makes it most economical. So when you're just looking at the economics of it, supporting utility scale renewable energy is a great choice. However, and this is coming from my own bias working at Bonneville Environmental Foundation, it is one of our important mission impact areas to increase equitable access to renewable energy. So in that case, supporting community solar for us is more important because of the co-benefits and the social impacts and the equities that it can bring to communities, low and medium income communities. So again, when you're looking at claims and you're kind of weighing pros and cons of various instruments, it's really about what resonates with you. When I'm working with people with carbon offsets, for example, some people are like, what's the most bang for my buck? How can I offset the most metric tons of emissions for this amount of money? Whereas other people really want the story. They want forestry and bunny rabbits and unicorns, and they want that story to tie to their commitment, which is great. And they're all important. It's what do you value? So in terms of renewable energy development and infrastructure, if that was my focus, I would support RECs from the largest utility scale projects that I could, because that's what's really gonna move the needle on getting more renewables on the grid. Let's see, did I miss anything else? Okay, great. Okay, so offsets and RECs, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about what each of these instruments are and how they work. Was there any questions about the unit of measure and the claims about them? Pretty good on that? Okay, so let's start with RECs. So renewable energy certificates, they are basically the tracking mechanism for the renewable energy attributes of electricity. So they weren't necessarily even created initially as a market instrument so that businesses can claim renewable energy. They really were for utilities to track renewable energy in the grid and between the grids. So what happens when you have, a wind turbine creating electrons, you've got, a coal plant creating electrons, those electrons are getting dumped into the grid, and it's like drops of water in the ocean. Once they're in there, they're all mixed up. There isn't like a tag on them. They aren't like green electrons and brown electrons. They're just all electrons once they're in the grid. So RECs were created to track the renewable energy coming through the grid. And then it was the forwarding of the REC market was created so that now businesses and other folks could claim those RECs. So if you purchase RECs, you're not necessarily getting green electrons off the grid, but you are purchasing the right to claim that you're using renewable energy, and that amount of renewable energy certificates is set aside for you for that claim and taken off the availability. So it's retired in your name. So I know it's a little bit of a confusing concept, but basically if you think of RECs as a tracking mechanism, that's the easiest way to think of it. And if you look at this graphic, I love this graphic. It's not my graphic. I think it's from, I just found it online, and it's really good, except for you can see where I put squiggly brown lines. That was just like me using like PDF tools and squiggling. So when the electrons go into the grid from the fossil fuel generator, you can see that those are gray. The green electrons go in, but when they come out, you don't really know where those electrons are coming from. So that little green arrow along the bottom, that's the tracking mechanism of the REC. And it is the industry-wide accepted instrument for making these types of claims. Does that make sense? Any questions about RECs? Cool. Okay, so now we've got carbon offsets, and these are a little different. So carbon offsets are a measurement of metric tons of greenhouse gases. And again, similarly to RECs, they track metric tons coming out of projects. I think one of the main differences though is the financial mechanism between an offset and a REC. So while RECs, yes, are a very important financial mechanism, And they do help forward the renewable energy industry as a whole because of the accumulative, aggregated, finances going into purchasing RECs and that going back into the renewable energy industry. Carbon offsets are a bit more specific. They have to meet something called additionality, which means that the project wouldn't have even happened without the projection of the income from offsets coming in, or without some kind of, so additionality means either financial, or it could be policy. Like, for example, if it is a nationwide policy that all landfills capture and reduce their carbon, then you couldn't make carbon offsets from landfill gas, right? So you have to have something that makes it additional. And that's what's different about carbon offsets from RECs. But ultimately, it's still a financial mechanism to get financing into projects that reduce greenhouse gases. So speaking of those projects, here are some examples. Again, feel free to throw any questions into the chat or speak out if you have a question. So with RECs, there's not too many various types of projects. There's wind and solar and some biogas out there. With offsets, there's a whole bunch of different types of projects. And again, like I was saying earlier, there's projects that are maybe a little bit more efficient, that for lower cost, you can sequester more carbon. And then there's some that are maybe a little less efficient, but they have more of a story to them. So forestry, nature-based projects are really popular right now, especially forestry, grasslands. But renewable, there's definitely confusion sometimes because you can have a renewable energy project that produces offsets instead of RECs. They're not allowed to do both. But some renewable energy projects actually do choose to sell offsets instead of RECs. I have a question from Chris. If you have an EV on your property, do you get offsets for the energy used? We have one that we installed and anyone can use it, an EV station. So that's actually really interesting. So you don't get offsets necessarily. However, that little EV station, I put that in there because a brand new methodology was just approved. That's an EV aggregation methodology, which involves many different campuses, whether they're business campuses or university campuses, where they are creating offsets from the energy saved with the EV stations. You would probably need to have more than one EV station on your property to qualify for that methodology. But what you're getting without the offsets, if it's on your property, is you're getting you are getting reduced emissions if you're calculating emissions from the cars that are parked there. However, you might be getting higher electricity bills. So really it just counts towards your emissions calculations. But there is a cool EV offset methodology out there. Okay, cool. Any questions about project types? Nope, okay, cool. We're getting there, folks. Almost there.
I have one quick question, Heather. Sorry to be the one to ask. I was curious, I have heard different things about projects that are planting trees versus projects that are like keeping forests safe. Do you have any thoughts on that, I guess?
Yes. Yeah, so forestry offsets is a very large category that includes many types of forestry. So there's reforestation and afforestation. Both of those are basically tree planting. Reforestation is planting trees where there used to be forest, but it was deforested. Afforestation is planting trees where there were no trees to begin with. And then there's sustainable forestry management, which is managing how, usually it's a timber company or maybe a family-owned forest, managing how the land is either protected or how the trees, how long the trees grow before they're cut, kind of thing, or narrowing pathways for the trucks to get through, which allows more trees to sprout up. All kinds of management of the forestry. So it's not planting new trees necessarily, it's managing and keeping and sequestering that CO2 in the trees that are there. So it's not necessarily that any of them are better or worse. There's just different things to consider for each. Tree planting, for example, it takes like 10 years, assuming that they survive. There's a lot of die-off in tree planting. Assuming they survive, it takes 10 years for them to even sequester the amount of carbon that is an existing tree that could be preserved or conserved, right? There's conservation offsets as well in forestry, where you're basically just conserving for nature. I'll get to that question in just a second. So there's many types of forestry offsets. So if you are interested in forestry offsets, make sure you ask about the type and understand which methodology is being used. Okay, Julie has a question. A forester project has to be certified to count as an offset. Yeah, and I'm only speaking of certified third-party offsets that are verified and tracked and registered. So yeah, it's not counted as an offset if you just go plant trees somewhere. You have to actually be certified and verified. Was that the question you were asking, Julie? I want to make sure I answered that for you. Okay, let me know if you have more questions. Feel free to shout out. Okay, so I'm going to get to some of the really fun and hairy stuff here now, claims and language. So if you do choose to use carbon offsets or RECs to balance your unavoidable footprint, it can get a little hairy, and it can be very nuanced, the type of language that you can use for each of these. And this is definitely an area that I recommend you talk to me, or you talk to any of the list of sustainability consultants that I'll have at the end if you're confused or not sure what you can say about what you're doing. Because this is where you'll get in more, not that there's like any, you know, there's not like carbon offset police out there or claims and language police out there. You know, you're not going to get fined or anything. I don't think any of you are reporting to CDP, but where you could get in trouble is making a claim and someone digging about it and someone maybe giving you some bad PR, and you know, bad PR can be worse than a fine, you know? So this is why I would say just be very careful with what you say. There's so many, you know, catchphrases out there that people want to say because it's easy and you think people are going to understand it, you know, carbon neutral, climate positive, even net zero, which I'm going to talk about in a second. None of these are bad claims, but you just need to be really, really thorough and transparent about what you mean when you say that, because most of these claims, even though we hear them all the time, most of these claims do not have any kind of actual guidance or framework for making the claims. A lot of people think they do. There must be some organization out there that's making some kind of, you know, framework for, if you check these boxes, you can say this. And there just really isn't for most of these claims. So that's why you want to be careful. If you say it, just make sure you're backing it up by, you know, if you say you're carbon neutral, somewhere in your sustainability report or on your website, you might want to say, we've purchased offsets for scope 1 and scope 2. Maybe you didn't even do scope 3, but there are people making carbon neutral claims who don't offset scope 3 or even address scope 3. So those are important things to think about. So being really transparent, these are some examples of things you could say if you did purchase offsets and RECs. You could be very specific, you know, offset scope 1 and 2 emissions. Nobody's going to know what that means, but you should probably put it somewhere in your sustainability report or on your website, and then maybe list out what that means. Our electricity and our natural gas and our fleet vehicles, right? So being specific about all of that. You can say you offset through verified carbon offsets. You could say we offset our travel and our shipping. Right? So you can be specific about, you can choose those boundaries. You know, maybe we haven't gotten to our fleet vehicles yet, but we're doing our shipping, you know, our third-party shipping. And you can be specific about the type of offsets you're using. We use forestry offsets. RECs is where you can make those renewable energy claims. You can be specific about the type. If you buy wind RECs, you can say you use wind power. If you buy solar RECs, you can say you use solar power. And people definitely get a little more hung up on the RECs because they're like, how can I say I'm using wind power when I'm just buying a certificate? Well, you can. That's the legal framework. RECs are a legal and financial instrument, and EPA and greenhouse gas protocols have all accepted them as the instrument by which you can make those claims. So I know some people find that disingenuous, but it's not. It really is the tracking mechanism, and you can say that. And to throw even more of a wrench into it, think of it this way. As a tracking mechanism, say you put solar panels on your roof. You're like, well, those electrons are definitely going into my building. Well, if you sell the RECs from that solar panels, you actually can't say you're using renewable energy anymore. If you sell the RECs, you've sold your right to say that. So I know that may or may not be something that any of you do. Some of you may be considering putting on-site renewables onto buildings or any buildings that you might own. Please be careful when you contract with somebody that you do retain the RECs. You do not sell them, because if you sell them, you can't say you're using renewable energy anymore. So that's a little tricky, but that's what it is. Any thoughts or questions about that? Oops, there you go, quick fingers. Nope, okay. And again, just cannot iterate enough how important it is to just be really clear, really transparent. The more detail about your claims, the better. You know, if you want to use one of the popular catchphrases, that's totally fine. Just make sure you're backing it up. And speaking of cool claims, B Corp Climate Collaborative. I'm wondering, I don't know, I see this is where if I was in a room, I just ask you to raise your hands. How many people are on the B Corp Climate Collaborative? I'm just gonna pretend everybody raised their hands. I can't see you all anyway. So the NetZero 2030 challenge, this is probably the instigating reason why a lot of you are on this call today. It's because you probably want to understand a little bit more about this and how you can reach it. So first and foremost, the basic information I've given you today about calculating your carbon footprint and the scopes is where you do need to start. Start by calculating and measuring. And as I said, I'm going to give you lots of resources to help you with that. There's a lot of great B Corp sustainability consultants out there that help with this. I can help you with this. There's online calculators and things like that as well. But start by measuring your footprint first and foremost. And then developing a net zero plan is the next step. Well, what does net zero even mean? Is it the same thing as carbon neutral? Not exactly. And I will tell you that the IPCC has a definition, but it doesn't really have a framework. So the definition is anthropogenic, which is man-made. Man-made emissions of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere are balanced by man-made removals over a specific period. So that is the definition. There just isn't yet a single standard or framework out there that defines it or how it should be communicated just yet. So no reason to panic though. There are lots of organizations working on it. So with this huge uptick in climate commitments, it's amazing. There's a lot of organizations trying to keep up so that there is a framework and a more standardized way to make these claims. So start with your measurements, do that first. And then I believe in the next 6 months or so, there will be some frameworks coming out. Science-Based Targets Initiative is definitely working on it. And so is B Corp. As I said, Jennifer Cooper, who was not able to join us today, I had a great email back and forth with her, and she said that the Climate Collaborative for B Corp is also working on it. So you guys will have more guidance. Information is forthcoming about that. But for now, I would focus on measuring and reducing as much as possible. And there's lots of other people out there who can help you. Certainly I can help. My email and all that will be on the last slide. I'm happy if anybody just wants to reach out with random questions. No such thing as a stupid question. Just reach out if you do have just random questions about any of this. I'm happy to help as much as I can. But there's also all of these other amazing organizations. Most of these are B Corps. A few of them are not. Some of them are just folks that I just happen to know in the sustainability industry that I've worked with that I know are great. So, definitely keep this on hand when you get to the point where you think you might need more help. Okay, Chris. How is NetZero differ or related to the UN SDG for climate the B Corp has adopted? Yes, that's the UN SDG for climate is what, as Jennifer was telling me, it's what they're hoping to use to guide their guidelines for what NetZero is going to mean for you guys. So hopefully they'll be able to come up with a framework based on that SDG. The SDGs themselves are actually still working on it too. Everybody's working on this right now. They're all working on frameworks for making net zero claims. Yeah. I think the science-based targets work on this will be really interesting to watch because they're coming at it from the science-based targets perspective, which is what is needed to stop warming to under 1.5 degrees. So they're looking at it really specifically from that perspective. But I do believe that what Jennifer was telling me is that you guys are probably going to get a framework more based on the SDGs. Okay, so we're getting there, almost done. Does anybody want to do some math? Speaking of calculating, just in case anybody wants to wake up their brain, I do have a quick pop quiz for you. If anybody wants to try and tackle any of these, the first two are quite simple. The last one is maybe a little bit more complicated, but just to give you a little taste of what actually doing the calculations is like, you have to find these coefficients. So in the scope 1, the coefficient is 0.0053 metric tons of CO2e per therm. So when I use the word coefficient, that's what I mean. It's the amount of metric tons per unit of whatever it is you're trying to compare it to. So for natural gas, it's per therm. For a flight, it might be per passenger mile, right? For electricity, if you wanted to convert electricity to offsets, it might be per megawatt hour. So the coefficient is that multiplier. Is anyone actually working on these? I'm kind of curious. I will give the answers in a second. So it's really important to try and find those coefficients when you are ready to do, like you asked, I think it was Kelsey was asking about, you know, how do I actually do this? What are the numbers? Where are the resources for this? Yeah, there's several. Even the coefficient for natural gas on here, this is from one resource. If you go to another resource, it might be slightly different. You can do comparisons if you want, but usually you can just choose one, go for it, put an asterisk and say this is where this reference is, and usually you can call it good. All right, so let's see. Oh, somebody's on it. Scope 1, 530, 100,000 is 0.5003. Oh, I'm sorry, Calvin, I don't understand your question. But I'm gonna go to
I was just a guess. I thought you wanted us to actually do the calculations. I wasn't sure if I was doing it correct. So I did 100,000 therms of natural gas. Yeah.
Oh, I see. 530 is your answer. Yes, gold star. Thank you, Calvin.
I just showed my work also. That's what it was.
You did. I see. I put this on here, but I'm totally like not a teacher. So that's probably like teacher language that I don't understand. So here are the answers for you guys. You can see, again, conversions are always fun. That's usually where I make my errors, is in conversions. I had to do a shipping calculation the other day where everything was sent to me, I think in kilograms. I had to convert it to pounds, and then I had to convert it again to something else. I don't remember, but I had to do like 5 conversions of data just to get it to match the coefficient that I had, which was in tons, not metric tons, but it was American tons per ton mile. It was like, oh my gosh. So I do like doing this stuff. It's kind of fun, but I certainly can mess it up too sometimes when I get a coefficient wrong. So double check your work always. What is the ballpark market cost of purchasing RECs or offsets? Yes. So RECs have quite a wide range. I lost track of my clock, so I actually don't know what time it is. How am I doing on time?
We're about 13 minutes.
Okay, great. Yeah, and definitely, yeah, start throwing a bunch of questions in here because I only have like 2 more slides anyway. So, so ballpark price of RECs. So right now, any RECs that you guys might buy are probably going to range, if you wanted some that were specifically from the Pacific Northwest, they're going to maybe be in the $7 or $8 range per rec, so that's per 1,000 kilowatt hours. If you were okay with a national, like a US domestic national portfolio, they probably come from somewhere in Texas or Oklahoma, those are going to be closer to $1 to $2 per rec. There's places where recs cost hundreds of dollars per rec because of the state RPSs, so all these renewable portfolio standards in certain states, they drive up the price of recs from their state or from their region because they need them for their state commitments. So rec prices can definitely vary widely, but typically I would say if one of y'all wanted recs from a third-party provider, you'd be looking at between $2 and $8-ish. You can also sign up obviously through your utility. I think the current pricing of Pacificor Pacificor PGE is closer to $10 or $12 per rec if you added it all up. So that's about the range. Offsets, those range from maybe $4 per offset to $15 per offset, depending on the technology or methodology. Nature-based offsets are usually more expensive, so grasslands and forestry, things like that are going to be more on that higher $10 to $15 range. Things like landfill gas sequestration or renewable energy offsets, like wind offsets, are going to be closer to like $4. Okay, and as I said, just a couple more slides here, but again, feel free to jump in with questions. I just wanted to show you guys this really cool tool from the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Equivalencies online calculator. They have this tool where you can put in your data. In this case, I put in 10 metric tons. I think this is a great tool to help with your storytelling and like to help translate a little bit of what's going on. Because if I told you, if we worked together and we calculated your emissions and I said, okay, grand total, your business emits 10 metric tons of greenhouse gases a year. And you're like, yay, what does that mean? I have no idea, right? So this is a really helpful tool to help translate that. What does 10 metric tons mean? Well, it's about 2 cars driven for a year. It's about 1 house, powered for a year, or about 165 tree seedlings grown for 10 years. Remember what I said earlier about trees? When you're planting them, it takes a lot of them to build up, whereas it's about 13 acres of preserved forest, but it's about 165 seedlings grown for 10 years, right? So that's a big difference. We're looking at Calvin. We're looking at purchasing some land that includes wetlands. Cool. Talk about wetland banks. How can we include? Okay. Can I talk about wetland banks and how we can include that into our carbon offset? So do you mean how can you use that against your carbon footprint, or are you wanting to turn those wetlands? Are you wanting to use those wetlands to produce carbon offsets, like through a methodology?
I'm not entirely sure. When I was originally talking with the real estate agent about the land, we have to purchase wetland along with the usable land where we're going to build our new building.
Okay.
And they said, hey, the great example of, or the great idea of having this wetland is you can sell it to companies that need to use it. And earlier you had said if you had solar panels, you can't sell your rights to that. So if we choose not to sell our rights on the wetland, how does that help us, or what does that do for us?
Right, yeah, with offsets, it's different. You don't automatically get offsets from something like this. Offsets, you have to go through quite an extensive verification process. There has to be a methodology that already exists to produce offsets. So whereas with renewable energy, if you put solar panels on your roof, RECs are just kind of automatically produced, so you can sell them or keep them. But with wetlands, you would actually have to go through a process and intentionally create offsets from them. But if you have this land, it also depends on how much land. If it's just a couple of acres or even a couple hundred acres, it probably isn't enough to really have a meaningful carbon offset project created from it, because you really need a project that's big enough that makes it worth that cost to go through the verification, which can be quite expensive. So that's why most
it's about 6 acres, so it's not that much.
No, yeah. But it's great to just preserve that land, and you know, it is a carbon sink. So whether or not you can actually count it towards your carbon footprint or anyone else's carbon footprint or create offsets, it's important to continue to conserve land. So I love that you guys are buying that. Save it, preserve it. That would be the best thing to do with it. And then I think we're on our last, remember this? Does anyone feel like they might even have an inkling of how to answer these questions now? Please put yes or no into the chat for me. Yay. That is what I was hoping. Inkling, good. Even an inkling is good. And I am here to help turn that inkling into, what do inklings turn into? Flows of information. So I'm here to help for anything that you guys need. Let's see, Devin. Oh, you've been using the TerraPass calculator. Yeah, scope 3 is 40 metric tons. Cool. I'm curious what they include in scope 3 on the TerraPass. I'm assuming travel and maybe shipping.
Yes, it's physical location, it's your fleet, it's your commute. So the fleet being, you know, we do deliver technology to customers all around. So it's our commuting during our business day. They also include the commuting, you know, at either side of the day. Air travel for us, which is almost non-existent.
Yeah.
Shipping, which is our biggest one.
Yeah.
And then servers and some of the IT infrastructure that draws a lot of energy.
Yeah.
They don't have an option for if you host everything in the cloud, and we do. So,
Okay.
which
Yeah.
depends on where you host it and what part of the country and all that. But it gets murky when you're trying to look at that for scope 3. Microsoft has made a pledge to go historically carbon neutral by 2050, or no, 2050. They're gonna be carbon neutral by 2030, or whatever that means, and historically carbon neutral by 2050. So anyway, it's very hard to figure out what is our actual consumption from our cloud servers or our cloud applications.
Yeah, that definitely probably goes a little bit deeper than any of the online calculators that I am aware of. We actually also have an online calculator at Bonneville Environmental Foundation that's very similar to TerraPass's, just from what you've told me. And I have dinked around on theirs. There's a little bit before too, now that I think of it. You know, the challenge with online calculators is that you can only get so specific and so nuanced with that. So that's why it is good. You know, I think they're a great starting place, and I would highly encourage folks to either go on TerraPass. I think, and we have an online calculator. I think Carbon Credit Capital, that's a B Corp, they might have an online calculator. I also have just a spreadsheet that I created that's great for dumping data into and just keeping track of your data year over year. That's basically a spreadsheet version of our online calculator. So it's a good starting place, but at some point, usually with these kinds of nuances, you probably would need a little bit of guidance from a consultant who maybe knows a little bit more about how to get deeper on some of these. I will say, just to be fully transparent with my capabilities and what I'm able to do, I am able to help and happy to help with most basic types of calculations, helping to find coefficients and give you tips and ideas on how to collect that data. But at a certain point, like if you start getting really deep into supply chain, that is certainly where I would say use one of these lovely consultants that I've listed here, because they're really good at that stuff. And I have other things that I also need to do in my job, and I don't do consulting full time, but I am happy to help with the most basic stuff and happy to hand you off when it gets to that point. So the cloud, when it comes to servers in the cloud, it's really about electricity usage, obviously, but it's like, where is that electricity usage? You know, where's the home base for that? And is it scope 2? Does it land into scope 3? Are you guys actually paying the bills for that electricity usage? You know, where is that landing? So, all right, I think we might have made it to the end with 3 minutes to spare. Any other thoughts, any other questions, any other resources? I know there's a lot of people on the call who know about this, maybe as much as I do. Is there anything I missed? Anything you want to share?
The one thing I would just say is, Devin, I've been working with Pachama in the past, and they actually did help me out with some of the information around servers, since we had servers at our office. So,
well, that's great. Okay.
you
I
kind of have
haven't
to go through
worked
their
with them
sales
before.
cycle, but they'll get you the data.
Okay. All right. Cool. Thanks. That's awesome.
All right. I'm going to take us back so we can see everybody's faces before we all go.
Any other questions, y'all? Heather, thank you so much for all this information. It's just fascinating and incredible detail. Thank you for answering everyone's questions.
I try. But feel free to follow up as well if you guys have any other questions. I'm happy to help out. I'll throw my email in the chat if you guys need.
Wonderful. Yes, and we will be sending out a recording of this call as well, and sharing the slides on the B Local PDX website. So feel free to check that out there. Make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter where all of that information will come out as well. And again, just thank you so much, Heather, for taking, an hour and a half to explain all of this and chat with everyone. We really appreciate your time and all of your valuable insights.
Yeah, no problem. This stuff is fun for me. I wish I could see you all in person, but I'll take y'all on Zoom for now until we meet again.
Wonderful. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today.
Bye. Take care.